Hey there, if you've been following news about the Rivian R2 recently, you may have noticed there's not been much of it. Pretty much all that we've gotten is that a couple of the manufacturing builds came off of the line and they took them on a road trip down Route 66. And I think they may have been doing something kind of important on that road trip, and I think it might have to do with autonomy. So let's talk about it. Before I get into talking about R2, if you've been watching my videos, you may have heard me talk about an upcoming Autonomy showdown that I'm doing. Don't worry, that is still coming. I probably started teasing it a little bit too early. We're going to be filming that one shortly, and honestly, I'm super excited about it. So if you're interested in seeing that, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. It's coming the third week of February. All right, back to the R2. There is no shortage of hype and excitement about the Rivian R2 right now, and everyone wants more information. But one thing that I've been asking is the autonomy system even ready? Well, I actually think that they might still be tuning some last few things before the R2 launches. And I think that's what they were doing on that road trip. They were collecting more R2 data. Editor Mike here, and I just wanted to make one quick clarification. The vehicles that they took on Route 66 were manufacturing validation builds. They were vehicles that had come off of the actual manufacturing line that will be used for production. So the primary motive of this road trip was more than likely to make sure that the vehicles coming off the factory line are up to snuff when it comes to build quality. That said, that doesn't mean that they didn't have ulterior motives as well, like the autonomy stuff. So the natural question is, if they already have a large driving model that's working on the R1, and this driving model is supposedly compatible with any vehicle that Rivian makes, why do they need R2 specific training data? Well, we'll come back to that, but first, let's talk about the specific hardware that the R2 is going to have. As of their autonomy day in December, they told us that they're going to include a LiDAR, and they're also going to include their own processor chip, the RAP1, for the first time in the R2. But that's not going to be in the launch edition of the R2. That's going to be coming later in 2026. At launch, it's going to have the Gen 2 platform, basically the same computer that the R1 Gen 2 has, the dual NVIDIA Orin chip system. The sensors are slightly different, which we'll get into in a second, but it's the same platform. But even though it's launching with essentially the same computer that the R1 Gen 2 has with the dual NVIDIA Orin chips, there's definitely some things that they're going to have to work through in order for all that they've learned on the R1 to transfer to the R2. So let's talk about a few reasons why. Even though the computer itself is working with the same processors and the same pipeline, the sensors are actually slightly different. There's 10 extra megapixels worth of camera resolution on the R2. They haven't told us exactly where that extra resolution has come from. My personal opinion is that it probably comes from the interior cabin camera that's monitoring the driver. That was the only camera, as far as I know, in the R1 that wasn't engineered by Rivian, so that's probably where they're putting that on the inside of the cabin. As far as the rest of the cameras go, they're probably the same resolution, but they do have a higher dynamic range than the ones found on the R1. So same resolution, but slightly better sensors. The other change to the hardware is the corner radars. Instead of having the little sonar sensors on the bumpers for helping with parking situations, the corner radars have been converted to dual mode radars, which means they can operate in long range mode, which is what you need when you're driving down the road and on the freeway. But they can also operate in short range mode where they provide small distance readings to assist with parking. And that way you kind of get more out of that one sensor and you aren't spending as much money on all the little sonars. But honestly, the minor sensor differences between R1 and R2 probably aren't making the biggest difference when it comes to applying the learnings from one vehicle platform to another. And this is because of how Rivian has put together their LDM, their large driving model. And yes, that does sound like LLM or large language model on purpose, because it operates very much the same way. Rivian has built their LDM so it's sort of platform agnostic, so that it can run on top of any different set of sensors. So it's any perception stack that you throw at it, it can figure out how to drive. And obviously it's not that simple. There are some things that have to change, but in the case of a few extra megapixels and a little bit of extra dynamic range, probably not the biggest deal. What is a bigger deal is body schema. And before we talk about what body schema even means and how that applies to R2, there are a few things, even on the R1, that I think Rivian needs to address before the R2 launches. If you're interested in seeing a deep dive on this subject, I did a video here where I talked about the first version of Rivian's universal hands-free and all of the amazing things that it does and all of the shortcomings that it has. There are a few takeaways when I was doing that research I found that definitely require some polish before they go to the R2, which is going to be a mass market volume selling vehicle. And the first one is the sharp curve warning. The more that I've driven with universal hands-free, the more it's apparent this is definitely something that needs some polish. This is a map-based warning that the system tries to determine when it's going around a curve that is too sharp. And sometimes it will have you put your hands on the wheel, sometimes it'll have you take over entirely, and quite often it feels misplaced. It feels like it's having you take over for either gentle or non-existent curves, or in the case of some even more aggressive curves, the system is perfectly capable of handling it, but it makes you take over. For example, just this last weekend, I was doing some canyon driving, and the canyon had some very tight, windy curves, and the system was handling it beautifully. But then I got out onto the interstate, and there was a gentle curve that it freaked out, and it had me take over on the on-ramp because it was a tiny, gentle curve. So addressing that, I think, is going to be a huge one for customer satisfaction. Number one, bang for buck. The second one that I think needs to be addressed, and this will probably happen rapidly as they accrue miles and more training data, is perception stability. And what I mean by that is the perception stack, the cameras and the radars, are very good at determining where objects are and how fast they're moving. However, the sensor data is still a little bit noisy. And if you noticed vehicles on the visualization, as you approach them and are passing them in an adjacent lane, for example, sometimes they tend to wiggle around a little bit and there's a little bit of noise in there. And normally that's not that big of a deal. But it does become a big deal when you're passing a larger vehicle, for example, a semi on a 2-lane road. But there have been numerous times when I've been passing a semi truck and it's very clearly within its lane, but the sensor noise makes it think that the semi is sort of wiggling around in its lane, and it gets freaked out because it thinks that the semi momentarily is jumping into my lane, and it will sort of get on the brakes and slow down and panic because of it. And it's not like a full-on like panic stop brakes on the freeway sort of situation. We don't have those sort of phantom braking scenarios of the days of yore with previous versions of another brand system. That said, it is a little bit disconcerting, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And it feels to me like this is more of a perception issue than a decision-making issue. It just needs to get a little bit better at denoising this, and that will likely come with a little bit more training data. And we can talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video and how the LiDAR relates to that. And the last one that I think that Rivian really needs to address before the R2 launches is turnoffs. Oftentimes when the lane widens, the vehicle will sort of veer towards the turnoff and try to take that instead of just continuing straight in the lane that you're already in. If Rivian is able to address these things before the R2 launches, I think it'll go a long way to making the system feel a lot more polished and ready for the masses. But now let's talk about the big one that might mean that Rivian is still trying to get the system ready to work at all, let alone these little niggles. And that is body schema. Real quick though, before we get too deep into body schema, if you're buying a Rivian and you find these videos informational or useful or interesting, use my referral code down below. You'll get up to 500 points to the gear shop, plus you'll get free charging. Okay, so back to body schema. The body schema is sort of how the vehicle feels, for lack of a better way to put it. It's how the dynamics of that vehicle specifically operate. Imagine that you get into a rental car that you've never driven, and for the first time as you're experiencing that vehicle, the steering wheel might take an extra turn to make that corner, or the accelerator might feel a little bit less responsive than it does in your vehicle, and it takes a moment for you to get used to how this new vehicle feels. That is the best way to describe body schema. And while the R1 and the R2 certainly do share a lot of traits, they are fundamentally different platforms, and so there's some body schema differences. For starters, the R2 is just a lot smaller. The cameras mounted on the windshield, for example, are a lot lower to the ground. Also, interesting to note, on the R1, they're actually slightly off-centered because the camera that is perfectly centered is the Mobileye camera from the previous driver assistance system that is no longer in use. So if you have an earlier build R1 Gen 2, they're off to the side with the Mobileye camera in the center. If you have a more recent build within the last few months, the Mobileye camera is completely gone, and you just have those Rivian built cameras that are slightly off-center. On the R2, however, the Rivian cameras are the only ones present, and they are perfectly centered on the windshield. That may not cause a huge difference, but having it lower to the ground certainly will, because the angle of the horizon is going to look a little bit different. The distance which the vehicle is going to be able to see is a little bit different. And even the suspension can play into this, because the R1 suspension is crazy. Love it or hate it, it is a very advanced system with adjustable height and airbags and roll control. And the behavior of that suspension under hard acceleration, hard braking, going around corners, it's going to fundamentally act differently than the suspension on the R2, which is entirely passive coil suspension. So maybe body lean will be a little bit more or a little bit less on the smaller, lighter, but less sophisticated suspension. And all of these little things definitely affect how the large driving model interacts with the R2. So sure, while the driving model itself fundamentally doesn't change, it still uses the same basics of decision making and understanding the world around it. The initial perception part and the part where it actually interacts with the physical vehicle does need to be trained a little bit. And you can bet that Rivian is working really hard on training this. I don't necessarily know exactly where in this process Rivian currently is, but it's quite possible that they're collecting data to help with this tuning specifically, to help take that LDM that was trained with R1 training data and help it learn how to drive on an R2. While there's a lot similar and most of that model can remain the same, there are a few tuning differences. Once they have these tuning differences fully tuned and figured out, it's safe to say that Rivian has made every attempt to make the large driving models applicable across multiple vehicle platforms. So hopefully this means once they have the tuning data collected and figured out, the LDM will be consistent across all of their vehicles. The R1 Gen 2, the Gen 2 R2, and even the Gen 3 Autonomy hardware will all run the same or similar LDMs, just tuned a little bit differently. Now, remember how I mentioned the LiDAR when it came to perception stability and vehicles not wiggling around? It's very likely that we'll see a huge improvement in that behavior once the R2 with LiDAR is driving around on the streets, because the LiDAR will help train the cameras even faster. And the hope is that the R1 Gen 2 and the R2 with Gen 2 hardware can learn from this information because they've abstracted the large driving model enough to run on any underlying platform. So yeah, hopefully Rivian gives us some more detail soon about the R2 and where they are in the process with it. But even the Gen 2 hardware is going to require a few changes for the R2. And I'm sure that all of these road trips that Rivian is going on has been hugely beneficial for it. So fingers crossed we get some more information soon, because just like you, I'm ready for more details. Here we go. It's go time. Oh, it's a video. All right, more polished and ready for the mashes. Hey there. Howdy there, cowboy. Okay,